Tonight for dinner, we are having my super delicious meatloaf. I did not eat a lot of meatloaf growing up, but I started making it as an adult, and I have kind of developed my own recipe over time, and it has become one of my favorite weekend dinners. Cheers. So I make my meatloaf a little bit differently. Of course, I start with a pound of ground beef like everybody does. This is 85/15. I like to do a little bit leaner, but I think if you go too lean, it is just not as good as the fattier ground beef. Instead of using a second pound, however, I like to use a packet of extra firm tofu. This is a 14-ounce pack once it's drained. I like tofu. I like to add tofu because it's cheaper, it keeps it moist, it still adds a good amount of protein, and tofu is really, really good for you for lots of reasons anyways. You really can't taste anything. Tofu doesn't have a taste. I add all of the same seasonings that I add to my meatloaf. I just kind of double those, and I mix it all together, and it just comes together really, really nicely in the end. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to get this tofu pressed so that we can get out a little bit more of that moisture. So I've just drained out all the water that's in here, and I'm just going to set this in my tofu press. If you don't have a tofu press, you can really just set it on some, like underneath a lot of heavy stuff. I would set this on a small cutting board inside of a cookie sheet, and then just put a lot of weight on it, and that'll do the exact same thing. I've just set this here. I'm going to let it sit for about 20 minutes, and then when I come back, we're going to get everything all mixed together. My tofu has been pressed for about 20 or 30 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and take it out of here. And I just want to see how much liquid has come out. Looks like we've gotten out a little under half a cup, maybe about a third a cup of liquid. I'm really happy with that. The tofu's not dry, but it's a lot more dense than it was, and it's just going to crumble really, really nicely into this bowl. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, just crumble it up into tiny little pieces. And then I kind of cheat a little bit for my meatloaf. I add stuffing mix. It's already seasoned, and it gets me a nice variety in the size of the breadcrumbs that go in there, which I really like. And I don't actually use all of it, so I'm going to put some of the bigger pieces just back in the box because I'm not going to use those for this. But then the rest of it, I'm just going to put in this bowl, and I'm going to pour a little bit of milk in and give that a good mix. Just going to mix it up with a fork so everything gets soaked in the milk. And then once that's all soaking, I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to prep the rest of the meatloaf. I'm going to put in my pound of ground beef. And I'm also going to crack in 2 eggs. And the stuffing mix, I think, is only enough to season 1 pound of ground beef. Since I've essentially doubled it by adding in the tofu, I'm going to add in a little bit more seasoning. About a teaspoon of garlic powder, about a teaspoon of onion powder, maybe half a teaspoon of black pepper and half a teaspoon of salt. And then I'm also going to add in a whole bunch of this dried Italian seasoning. And then because I think it brings a little bit more freshness, I'm also going to add some of the lightly dried Italian seasoning from my fridge. Oh, that's not very much. Probably about a teaspoon of this too. And then my breadcrumbs have been sitting. They've soaked up all of the milk. I'm going to add in most of that. And then I'm just going to mix this all together. It's pretty important not to overmix your meatloaf mixture. If you overmix it, it comes out a little more dense. So kind of just mix it until it's well combined. Make sure that there's no big chunks of your breadcrumbs or the tofu or any egg left over. And then sometimes I'll find these bigger chunks of tofu. I just go in and break them up with my fingers and mix it all back in. The tofu and the milk-soaked breadcrumbs really work together to make this meatloaf stay moist. Even when it's reheated in the microwave, it basically never dries out. All right, my mixture is done. My oven is preheated to 350. I'm gonna wash my hands, get this in a loaf pan, and put it in. I'm gonna put a thin layer of oil in my loaf pan. I know I'm using non-stick, but a thin layer of oil just kind of helps ensure that nothing gets too stuck in there. And then I'm going to go ahead and just put my mixture in. And you do kind of want to press it down a little bit. You want to make sure it's one solid piece, but you don't want to press it so hard that the meatloaf becomes really dense. And then I'm going to make our sauce mixture. And this is a lot of meatloaf, so I'm making a whole lot of sauce. Probably got a little over half a cup of ketchup in here. I'm gonna do just a little squirt of mustard, maybe a teaspoon. And then just a little bit of Worcestershire sauce. Maybe about half a teaspoon. And then some of the same seasonings that went in the meatloaf are also going on the meatloaf. About a half a teaspoon of garlic powder and half a teaspoon of onion powder. And I'm going to give that a good mix. It's a little bit lighter in color than I actually want it to be, so I'm just going to add a touch more ketchup. And a touch more Worcestershire sauce. And then I really like the way this cooks with the meatloaf. I put the entire thing on now before the meatloaf goes in the oven. And if I end up needing to add a little bit of sauce later, I'll just make a little bit more later. And that is it. Meatloaf is ready to go in the oven. My oven's ready at 350 degrees. I'm going to throw this in And I've got a gas oven, so things take a little bit longer to cook. I'm gonna come check on it in 30 minutes, but I suspect it's gonna take a little bit closer to an hour to finish cooking. If you've got an electric oven, check on it in 20 minutes because it's not gonna take a full hour to cook. It's been 30 minutes, my meatloaf has been baking. I'm just checking the temperature now, and it is sitting at right around 132, 133. I'm going to check it in one more spot a little closer to the middle. That's a little lower, 125 or 126. I am going to put it back in for another 20 minutes and then I will come back to check on it. All right, my 20 minutes are up. I'm just going to check the temperature in a couple of places here. And we're at 168, which is perfect. Your goal is 165, which I am at in all three places. I am going to just cover this with foil and I'm going to let it rest on the stovetop while I get everything else all finished up. All right, my meatloaf is done. I'm going to go ahead and just take this out of the pan. Get it onto a cutting board. Now we like some pretty thin slices, but of course slice this however you like. And there it is. You can kind of see the little bits of tofu in the meatloaf, but you really don't taste anything. I wouldn't even say there's really a texture difference. It just keeps it moist, and because I added all of the extra seasoning in here, it tastes just like meatloaf.